I found the documents. My family never told me about the inheritance. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, nursing my third cup of coffee, when everything I thought I knew about my family came crashing down. It started so innocently, really. My nephew Daniel, who'd been staying with me for a few weeks while he figured out his job situation, had asked to borrow my laptop to send some emails. I'm not the type to snoop. I never have been. But when he returned the computer and left it open on the couch, my eyes caught something on the screen that made my stomach drop. There was a document title visible in the browser's recent history: Mary Henderson Estate Settlement, revised 2019. I sat there staring at those words for what felt like an eternity. My name, the word estate, and a date from 5 years ago that I had absolutely no recollection of. My hands started shaking as I moved the mouse, not entirely sure I wanted to know what came next. The browser history showed it had been accessed dozens of times over the past 6 months. Dozens of times. By my nephew. Someone who was supposed to be my family. Someone I'd helped through countless difficulties, accessing documents about me that I'd never even seen. My breath came shallow and quick as I clicked through the history, finding folders labeled with my name, files with descriptions that included words like beneficiary, trust distribution, and hidden assets. Hidden assets. That phrase kept repeating in my mind. What did that mean? What had been hidden from me? I picked up the phone to call my daughter Linda, my voice already shaking before she even answered. Linda, did you know anything about an estate document with my name on it? From 2019. There was a pause. A long, terrible pause that told me everything I needed to know before she even spoke. Mom, we didn't think it was important to worry you about it, she said finally, and those words, those carefully chosen, calculated words, made me feel like the ground beneath my feet had shifted irreversibly. I hung up without another word and sat in the silence of my kitchen, understanding with absolute clarity that nothing in my family relationships was what I'd believed it to be. The trust I'd built over decades, the sacrifices I'd made, the way I'd always put my family first, all of it had been operating under a complete lie. And the worst part wasn't the money, though God knew that would matter. The worst part was the deliberate deception. The fact that they'd known something profound about me, about my life, and had decided together, as a unit against me, to keep it secret. That moment changed everything. That Tuesday morning coffee became the line between my old life and whatever was about to come next. And I had no idea how far this deception ran. To really understand how I got here, you have to understand who I am. I'm Mary Henderson, 68 years old, and I've spent my entire adult life believing that family meant something. Real meaning. Not just the biological accident of being related, but a commitment to care for each other, to be honest, to put each other's well-being above comfort or convenience. I grew up as the middle child of 5, born in a small town in Massachusetts in 1956. My father was a postal worker, my mother a nurse, and by today's standards we had very little. But we had each other, and my parents made sure we understood that family loyalty was the most valuable thing we could ever possess. My father used to say, "Mary, the world will try to trick you, people will betray you, but family is sacred." I believed him completely. I built my entire life around that principle. I married young at 22, to a man named Robert who worked in construction. We had 3 children together. Linda, who's now 45, Marcus, who's 42, and Sarah, who's 39. Robert was a good provider but a difficult husband. He wasn't abusive in any violent way, but he was absent, emotionally unavailable, and eventually he had an affair that I discovered in the most humiliating way possible, running into them together at a grocery store. We divorced when the youngest was 8 years old. After that divorce, I became the primary wage earner and caregiver for my 3 children. I worked as a medical records clerk for 30 years at the local hospital, a job that didn't pay much but offered decent benefits and steady work. Every penny I earned went to my children's education, their activities, their futures. I picked up weekend shifts to pay for Marcus's baseball camps. I worked extra hours to help Linda through community college. I stayed up late helping Sarah with her college applications, driving her to interviews 2 hours away even when my back was screaming at me. My ex-husband, Robert, he came and went in our lives. Sometimes he'd be present for a few months, taking the kids on weekends, and then he'd disappear for stretches where I wouldn't hear from him. Child support was sporadic at best. But I never spoke ill of him to the children. I never poisoned them against him. I believed that they deserved to have their own relationship with him, and my job was to love them and support them through whatever that relationship was. Then, when I was 52 years old, my father passed away. He had a heart attack while walking to the mailbox one morning. He was 78. It was sudden and shocking, and I was devastated. But what I didn't know at the time was that my father had been successful in ways I'd never fully understood. My father had been a modest man, and he never talked about money. But he was also disciplined and careful. He'd invested wisely over the decades. He'd inherited a small amount from his own parents, and he'd turned that into something substantial through careful management and a genuine knack for understanding the stock market. When he died, his estate was much larger than any of us children realized, approximately $250,000, which in that time period was a very significant sum. The estate was divided equally among his 5 children, so each of us received about $50,000. I remember the lawyer calling me, and I remember feeling this huge mix of grief and gratitude. My father was gone, but he'd given me something that could help secure my children's futures. I used that money carefully. Part of it went into a trust for my youngest daughter Sarah, designated for her college education and protected from any potential financial hardship. Part of it I invested conservatively for retirement. And the rest, about $20,000, I spent on home repairs that I'd been putting off for years, and on helping Linda with a down payment on her first condo. But here's what I didn't know. My father had also set up something else. Something separate. He had created an additional trust specifically for me, his favorite child. He told my mother once, and she'd confided in me years later. He was worried about my financial security after the difficult divorce, and he wanted to make sure I had a safety net that would be there for me in my later years. He set this trust up to mature and distribute when I turned 65, which would be just as I was preparing for retirement and would need that security most. That trust, according to the documents I would later find, was worth approximately $375,000. $375,000 that my own family knew about and never told me. My mother passed away 8 years before I discovered this document, about 10 years after my father. She died of complications from diabetes, and in her final years she was struggling with memory issues that developed into early-stage Alzheimer's. I was the one who handled most of her care. I was the one who moved her into an assisted living facility when she could no longer live alone. I was the one who visited her 3 times a week without fail, even when the disease had progressed to the point where she didn't always recognize me. But before her memory deteriorated completely, she did mention something to me once. I was sitting beside her bed in the assisted living facility, and she looked at me with this strange intensity in her eyes and said, "Mary, your father took care of you. Remember that. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. He took care of you even after he was gone." I thought she was being poetic about my emotional support, about the memory of our father helping me grieve and move forward. I didn't realize she was literally telling me about a $375,000 trust that had been set up in my name. When she got worse and could no longer have coherent conversations, I was the one who made all her medical decisions. I was the one who sat with her for hours reading her favorite books, playing her favorite music, making sure her final years had as much dignity and comfort as they possibly could. My siblings helped, but it was me who was there consistently, who bore the emotional weight of watching our mother fade. And all that time they knew. All that time my 3 living siblings knew that our father had set up a trust for me. They knew it was substantial. They knew I was still working full-time as a single mother, that I was stressed about money, that I was worried about retirement. And they never mentioned it once. I found out later through the documents that the trust was supposed to distribute automatically when I turned 65. It was supposed to be automatic and straightforward. But my siblings, Linda, Marcus, and my younger sister Patricia, had hired a lawyer to contest the trust. They claimed that our father's mental state at the time he created it was questionable, that he was influenced by undue circumstances when he created this specific trust for me. They did this without ever mentioning it to me. They tied it up in legal proceedings for 3 years. During those 3 years I turned 65. I had expected to receive nothing. Nobody had told me there was anything to receive. I'd planned my retirement based on my Social Security, my modest pension from the hospital, and my small investments. I was going to have to work part-time for several more years to make ends meet. And meanwhile, my siblings were in court fighting over whether I deserved the money our father had specifically designated for me. The reason I eventually found out, the reason those documents ended up where Daniel could accidentally leave them visible on my laptop screen, was that the legal battle had finally been settled. About 6 months before I discovered those documents, my siblings' attempt to contest the trust had been denied. The judge had looked at my father's will, at the extensive documentation of his mental competency, at the clear and deliberate nature of his intentions, and he'd ruled that the trust should be distributed as my father had intended. $375,000, minus legal fees that I hadn't even known they were incurring, was finally released to me. And they didn't tell me. They never called. They never said, "Hey Mary, good news, Dad's trust finally came through. You're going to get a substantial inheritance." Nothing. They received the distribution to my account without ever informing me or asking me anything about it. When I eventually demanded to know why they'd never told me, the explanations I got were infuriating in their casual dismissiveness. "Mom, we didn't want to get your hopes up," Linda had said. "We didn't know if the court would rule in our favor, and we thought it would just be stressful for you to know about it while it was tied up in legal battles. We were protecting you," Marcus said, as though lying to your mother for 3 years is somehow a form of protection. And Patricia had simply said, "It was complicated. We needed to figure it out first." But that's not actually what had happened. What had actually happened was far more complicated and far more hurtful than any of them wanted to admit. And I didn't realize the full extent of it until I started pulling on the threads of this revelation and discovering just how deep the deception went. The documents I found on Daniel's laptop opened up a rabbit hole that I'm not sure I've fully emerged from even now. He'd been accessing the files because Linda had sent them to him, asking him to help her with something related to her financial planning. But as I read through everything, as I pieced together the timeline and understood what had actually occurred, I started to see a pattern that made me feel sick. Let me be clear about something. My family is not malicious. They're not bad people. They're ordinary middle-class people who live ordinary lives. Linda is a nurse practitioner who works hard and cares deeply about her patients. Marcus runs a successful construction company, the same work his father used to do. Patricia is an accountant and divorced like me, so you'd think she'd understand the financial strain of being a single woman managing her own retirement. None of them are cartoonishly evil. But there's something worse than malice sometimes. There's selfishness dressed up as concern. There's the casual cruelty of people who simply don't think about the impact of their choices on others. When my father's will had been read after his death, his attorney had specifically mentioned the separate trust he'd set up for me. The document was clear. But in the years that followed, it had started to bother my siblings in ways they'd never articulated to me. Because my father had given me an extra $125,000 beyond my share of the main estate. He'd been explicit about it. This was his way of ensuring that the child who had sacrificed the most, who had borne the most responsibility in raising her own family alone, would have security in her later years. But that decision, that generous, loving decision by our father, had created resentment. I could see it now, reading through the documents and the court filings. The resentment wasn't overt. It was subtle. It showed up in small comments over the years. "Dad always did favor you," Patricia had said once at a family dinner when I mentioned something I was worried about financially. "Dad felt guilty about your divorce," Marcus had said another time. "He wanted to make sure I had enough for my kids' education just like he wanted to make sure you had enough for yours," Linda had said. And that one had always bothered me because it wasn't true. My father had given her money for my youngest daughter's college fund, but he hadn't given her an additional $375,000 trust. They'd decided, without ever consulting me, that they deserved to have input on that money. They'd convinced themselves that contesting the will was reasonable, that they had a right to know whether I really deserved what our father had given me. And in doing that, in fighting my father's last wishes without ever telling me they were doing it, they'd crossed a line that I don't think any of us can come back from. When I discovered those documents, when I started making phone calls and demanding answers, the conversations became increasingly tense. Linda tried to explain it to me over coffee a few days later. We met at a little cafe near my house. and I watched her face as she tried to justify years of deception. "Mom, we were thinking about the family," she said. And I remember those words so clearly because they made me angry in a way I'd never been angry at her before. "We were thinking about fairness. Dad's decision to give you that much extra money, it felt like it was based on emotion rather than equity. And we were concerned that maybe his judgment wasn't entirely sound when he made that decision." "His judgment wasn't sound?" I repeated, and my voice sounded hollow even to myself. "Linda, your grandfather was 75 years old when he set up that trust. He was in perfect health. He lived for another 13 years. He was sharp as a tack for his entire life. And 3 separate doctors 3 separate times during the legal proceedings confirmed his mental competency at the time he created that document. You don't get to rewrite your father's wishes because you don't like them." "That's not what we were doing," she said, but her eyes couldn't meet mine. "We were trying to be fair to everyone." "You were trying to be fair to yourselves," I said. "You were trying to make sure that I didn't get something that you felt you deserved more. And you lied to me to do it." What Linda couldn't say, what none of them could say, was that they'd all been struggling with money to varying degrees. Marcus had made some bad investments. Patricia was dealing with a difficult divorce settlement. And Linda, despite her successful career as a nurse practitioner, had gotten caught up in lifestyle inflation, buying a big house and taking expensive vacations, only to find herself stressed about money later. It's never really about the money, is it? It's about what the money represents. It represents our Father's love. It represents His belief in me, in my worth, in my right to security and dignity in my later years. By contesting that trust, by hiring lawyers to argue that I didn't deserve it, by keeping me in the dark about the entire process, they were saying something much deeper than "we want to split this differently." They were saying, "We don't believe Dad's assessment of your value. We think we deserve this more than you do." And that's what broke something in me. In the days and weeks after discovering those documents, I went through a process of grief that I don't think I fully expected. I grieved for my family relationships as I'd understood them. I grieved for the trust I'd placed in them. I grieved for all the times I'd sacrificed financially for them, all the times I'd put their needs above my own, believing that family meant something and that they felt the same way. But I also started to get angry. And that anger, unlike my initial shock, was clarifying. I realized that this wasn't just about the inheritance. This was part of a larger pattern that I'd been ignoring for years because I didn't want to see it. It was the way Linda had assumed she could borrow money from me, repeatedly, when her finances were tight, never repaying most of it. It was the way Marcus had asked me to help him financially when his construction company was struggling, and I'd given him $20,000 that he'd paid back over 7 years only to ask for another $10,000 5 years later. It was the way Patricia had expected me to cover her assisted living costs for our mother when she said she couldn't afford her portion right now, and never offered to repay me. They had been comfortable taking money from me for years. They had been comfortable letting me work overtime and stress about retirement, while they secretly fought over the inheritance that my father had left specifically to secure my later years. They had been comfortable with the lie. I began to pull apart every financial interaction we'd had, every promise that had been made and broken, every time they'd assumed I had spare money to help them while I was cutting coupons to make ends meet. And I realized that I'd been enabling this dynamic through my own willingness to sacrifice. They had never had to respect me financially because I'd never insisted that they do so. I'd modeled codependence and called it love, and they'd learned their lesson well. The first thing I did was hire my own lawyer. I wasn't going to take what my father had left me lying down, and I wasn't going to let my siblings' attempted manipulation of that inheritance stand unchallenged in my own mind. I had to see all the documents. I had to understand exactly what they'd done. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chun who specialized in elder law and inheritance disputes, walked me through everything that had transpired. The trust my father had created was indeed substantial. After legal fees and taxes that my siblings had apparently been trying to avoid paying, which was another level of complication entirely, I was entitled to approximately $300,000 in liquid assets, plus some stock holdings in real estate that pushed the total closer to $420,000. $420,000 that had been withheld from me based on my own family's legal challenge to my father's explicitly stated wishes. "This is remarkable, actually," Patricia Chun said. reviewing the court documents with me in her office. The judge's ruling was very clear. Your father's intentions were unambiguous. The trust was properly established, properly funded, and properly documented. The only question in the court's mind wasn't whether he intended you to have it, but whether your siblings had standing to contest it at all. Why did the judge even let the case proceed? I asked. Because that's how the legal system works, she said. Anyone with a financial interest can challenge an inheritance. It doesn't mean their challenge has merit, but they do have the right to try. The problem here is that your siblings went forward with this challenge, spent money on legal fees, put themselves through the stress of litigation, and achieved absolutely nothing except delaying your inheritance by 3 years. And they never told me, I said, and I could hear the wonder and hurt in my own voice. I was a named beneficiary. I had a right to know. You absolutely did, Patricia agreed. In fact, I'm somewhat surprised they were able to keep this from you. The trust document should have been available to you. There are ethical guidelines about this sort of thing. But you have to know about a proceeding for you to contest it, and if you don't know. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. If I didn't know, then I couldn't protect my interests. If I didn't know, then my family could move forward with their legal challenge without me being able to mount a defense. If I didn't know, then they could do whatever they wanted. What do I do now? I asked her. Well, the funds have been distributed to you, she said. As of 6 months ago, they're in an account in your name, which is interesting because that means they're waiting for you to decide what to do with them. You could leave them invested. You could move them around. You could demand that your siblings reimburse you for any legal fees that you incurred as a result of their actions. I sat with that for a moment. Can I demand that they repay my attorney's fees for defending what was already mine? You could file a claim, she said carefully. Whether you'd win would depend on how aggressive you wanted to be. How aggressive did I want to be? That was the question that consumed me over the next several weeks. Because I had several options, and each one represented a different version of the person I could choose to be going forward. I could do nothing. I could accept the inheritance, quietly put it away for retirement, and pretend that the last 3 years didn't happen. This would require me to accept that my family had lied to me and contested my father's wishes without any consequences. This would require me to continue the pattern of pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. I could demand that they reimburse my legal fees and move on. This would be a measured response, something that addressed the financial harm without being vindictive. It would cost them money, but it wouldn't fundamentally disrupt our family relationships. Or I could force a reckoning. I could demand answers. I could make it clear that the dynamic we'd been operating under was fundamentally broken, and that I was no longer going to participate in it. I spent a lot of time thinking about my father when I was considering these options. I thought about all the conversations we'd had when I was growing up. He'd emphasized honesty, integrity, and the importance of confronting problems directly rather than letting them fester. He'd never been one for sweeping things under the rug. And he'd left me money specifically because he wanted me to have the power to make my own choices, to not be dependent on anyone else's goodwill or approval. By keeping quiet, I realized I'd be dishonoring that gift. I'd be accepting a form of disrespect that he'd wanted to protect me from. Called Linda first. We need to have a family meeting, I said. All of us. You, Marcus, Patricia, and me. This Saturday at my house. Mom, what's this about? She asked, and there was fear in her voice. She knew what it was about. She'd known the moment I discovered those documents that this day was coming. It's about the inheritance, I said. And it's about everything else that's been going on for years. I'm done pretending. This Saturday. Noon. Marcus was the first one to arrive, which surprised me a little. He's always been the most direct of my 3 children, the most willing to have difficult conversations. He brought coffee and pastries, which felt like he was trying to soften whatever was coming. I almost appreciated the effort. Hey, Mom, he said, kissing my cheek as he came in. This must be pretty serious if you're calling a family summit. Sit down, I said. We'll talk when everyone's here. Patricia arrived next and then Linda. We sat around my dining room table, the same table where I'd helped them with homework decades ago, where we'd shared countless holiday meals, where my mother had sat with me and tried to tell me something about my father taking care of me. I found the documents, I said without preamble. I know about the trust. I know about the legal challenge. I know that you hired lawyers to contest my father's will without ever telling me. I know that you've known about this for 3 years, and you kept it completely secret from me. There was a long silence. Then Linda started to speak, to launch into the explanation that she'd already given me, but I held up my hand. I don't want to hear excuses, I said. I want to hear the truth. Why did you think this was acceptable? Why did you think it was okay to challenge your father's explicit wishes? Why did you think it was okay to keep me in the dark? Because we felt like it wasn't fair, Marcus said, and at least he was honest about it. Dad didn't give us as much. We felt like he was punishing us because we didn't have as many financial problems as you did. So you decided to overturn his will? I said. You decided that you knew better than your father what he should do with his own money? It's more complicated than that, Patricia said. We were worried that you might be manipulated by the size of the inheritance. We thought maybe we should make sure it was legitimate before we told you about it, so you wouldn't get your hopes up and then be disappointed if the legal challenge succeeded. That's a lie, I said, and my voice was surprisingly steady. I know that's a lie because your own documents show that you never had any doubt about the legality of the inheritance. The doubt you had was about whether I deserved it. That's the only thing that ever motivated this challenge. Linda's eyes filled with tears. Mom, that's not fair. Isn't it? I asked. Let me tell you what's not fair. What's not fair is that I worked myself to exhaustion for 30 years to raise you 3 after your father abandoned me financially. What's not fair is that I skipped meals so you could have the things your friends had. What's not fair is that I picked up extra shifts and double shifts so I could send you to college and help you with down payments on houses and bail you out when your finances got tight. What's not fair is that I did all of that while assuming that we were a family that was honest with each other, that valued each other's well-being. We do value you, Marcus said quietly. Then why didn't you tell me? I asked, and now my voice broke a little. Why didn't you pick up the phone and say, "Hey Mom, some legal stuff just got finalized and you're about to inherit a substantial sum of money. Congratulations." Why did you keep me in the dark? Because we didn't want to deal with the fallout, Patricia said, and she said it quietly, almost to herself. We didn't want you to be angry with us. There it was. The real truth. They'd known what they'd done was wrong, and instead of owning it and dealing with the consequences, they'd chosen to cover it up. They'd chosen to prioritize their own comfort over my right to know what was happening with my own inheritance. Well, I said, that didn't work out for you. Over the next 2 hours, I laid out everything I'd discovered. I told them that I would be demanding that they reimburse me for every legal fee I'd incurred in figuring out what had happened to my inheritance. I showed them the invoices that added up to nearly $8,000. I told them that I was considering whether to pursue further legal action for the 3 years of interest that I'd lost out on because the money was tied up in their court challenge instead of invested in my name. I told them that their behavior had violated my trust in a fundamental way, and that going forward, I would be establishing boundaries that I should have established years ago. I am no longer available to you as an emergency financial resource, I said. Every penny you've borrowed from me over the years, every time you've asked me to cover costs and promised to repay me later, I'm done. If you need money, you'll figure it out like adults or you'll go to a bank. I'm not your safety net anymore. Mom, that's not realistic, Linda said. Life happens. Sometimes people need help. Life does happen, I agreed. But I need to know that when I help you, you're going to treat me with respect. That means being honest with me. That means not going behind my back. That means not treating me like someone whose rights don't matter as much as your comfort. So what happens now? Marcus asked. Now I wait for you to decide whether you're going to reimburse me for those legal fees, I said. And then I'm going to take some time to figure out what kind of relationship I'm going to have with each of you going forward. Because right now I don't have any trust left. And without trust, I'm not sure what we have. That family meeting fundamentally changed my relationships with my children in ways that I'm still processing. In the immediate aftermath, there was a lot of anger and hurt. Linda stopped calling me for 3 weeks. Marcus tried to approach it pragmatically, asking if we could sit down with a therapist to work things out. Patricia oscillated between angry and apologetic, depending on what day you asked her. But what they didn't do was reimburse me. What they didn't do was fully acknowledge that their behavior had been wrong. What they didn't do was respect the boundaries I was trying to establish. The first test of my new resolve came about 3 weeks after the family meeting, when Marcus called me in a panic. His construction company had lost a major contract due to a supplier's mistake, and he was facing a cash flow crisis. He needed $125,000 to make payroll and fulfill his obligations to his current clients, or the whole business was going to collapse. "Mom, I know we just went through all that stuff," he said, and he sounded genuinely distressed. "But this is different. This is an emergency. Can you help me?" 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately. I would have transferred money without even asking detailed questions. I would have told him not to worry about repayment and would have meant it. But 6 months ago, I didn't know that my own family had been trying to contest my inheritance behind my back. 6 months ago, I was a different person. "No," I said, and it was harder to say that word than almost anything I've ever done. "Mom, come on. This is my business. This is my livelihood. If this goes under, I lose everything." "I understand that," I said, "and I'm sorry. But the answer is no. You have options, Marcus. You can go to the bank. You can take out a business loan. You can ask your other siblings for help. What you can't do is come to me for a bailout after you've lied to me about my own money. This isn't about the inheritance money," he said, and there was real anger in his voice now. "This is emotional blackmail. You're punishing me for something that we all decided together." "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm protecting myself. I'm establishing a boundary. And I'm maintaining my integrity. Those are 3 different things, and I need you to understand the difference." He hung up on me. I didn't hear from him for 2 months. But you know what? The construction company didn't collapse. Marcus went to the bank, explained the situation, and they gave him a business line of credit. He had to pay higher interest rates because his credit wasn't pristine, but he survived. More than that, he built his business the right way, without relying on his mother's savings to bail him out. Linda's test came a few months later. She called me crying one evening, saying that her ex-husband had requested a modification to their custody arrangement for their oldest son, and she couldn't afford the lawyer fees to fight it. She needed $3,000. "I can't help you," I said, and I meant it. "But I can recommend a lawyer who works on contingency or on a payment plan, and I can support you emotionally through this process. But I'm not going to give you money." "You've changed," she said, and she said it like it was an accusation. "Yes," I agreed. "I have. And I needed to change. I'm sorry that's disappointing for you, but I'm not sorry that I'm protecting my own well-being." She ended up working out a payment plan with a lawyer, and her case resolved reasonably well. She never thanked me for the referral, but at least she learned that the world doesn't end when her mother isn't available to rescue her. Patricia called me about 9 months after that family meeting. She was quiet when I picked up, and I could tell she'd been crying. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something," she said. "Okay," I said, bracing myself for another request for money or another excuse for why they'd hidden the inheritance from me. "I talked to Linda and Marcus," she said, "and we've all been thinking about what you said. About the inheritance. About everything." I waited. "I want to apologize," Patricia said, and she sounded genuine. "What we did was wrong. We knew it was wrong at the time. We just didn't want to face the fact that we were wrong, so we pretended it wasn't a big deal. But it was a big deal, and it hurt you, and we treated you disrespectfully." "Okay," I said carefully. "I appreciate you saying that. And Linda and Marcus want to apologize too," she continued. "We talked about it, and we want to cover your legal fees. We should have done it immediately after the inheritance was distributed, but we were too stubborn and too scared. Will you let us make that right?" I felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't everything I wanted, but it was something. It was the beginning of acknowledgement. "Yes," I said. "I'll accept that." "And Mom," Patricia said. "I'm sorry for doubting that Dad made the right decision. He did. He wanted to take care of you, and we tried to interfere with that, and it was wrong. You deserved what he left you. You deserved better than what we gave you." I cried after I hung up that phone. Not sad tears, but something more complicated. Relief mixed with residual hurt. Gratitude mixed with a kind of melancholy for the family relationships I'd had before all of this happened. because I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. I couldn't go back to trusting them the way I had before. But maybe I thought we could rebuild something different. Something more honest. They paid me the legal fees, $9,000, because there were more costs than I initially mentioned. They paid it without making me ask twice. And then, slowly, over the course of months, Linda, Marcus, and Patricia began to change how they interacted with me. They started asking me how I was doing, really asking, not just going through the motions. They started respecting my time and my resources. They started treating me like a person with my own needs and boundaries, rather than a supporting character in their lives who existed to help them out when things got difficult. And I started to rebuild my life with this inheritance that my father had left me. The first thing I did was retire completely from hospital work. I was 68 years old, and I'd been thinking about retirement for several years, but I'd never felt secure enough financially to actually do it. With the inheritance, that security was finally there. I put in my notice, and 3 months later, I walked out of the hospital for the last time after nearly 40 years of service. I spent the first month of retirement sleeping. I'm not exaggerating. I think I'd been operating on adrenaline and worry for so long that when that was finally removed, my body just shut down and rested. I slept 10 hours a day. I took naps. I went to bed early. And it was glorious. Then, I started to explore what I actually wanted to do with my time now that I didn't have to work. I'd always wanted to travel, but I'd never had enough money or time. I took my first real vacation in 15 years. I spent 3 weeks in Italy, staying in little towns, eating fresh pasta, learning about art and history. I cried at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence because I'd never allowed myself to experience something so beautiful and self-indulgent before. I started volunteering at a local literacy nonprofit, teaching adults to read. This was something I'd wanted to do for years, but never had the energy for after working full-time. Now I could give my time freely, and it filled something in me that working in a hospital never had. I bought a new car, nothing fancy but reliable and comfortable. I got my bathroom renovated, something I'd been putting off for 5 years. I started taking art classes at the community center. I joined a book club. I went to concerts and museums and theater productions. I allowed myself to spend money on things that brought me joy, and it turned out that when I actually had the money to do so, I was fairly responsible about it. But more importantly, I started to think about my life differently. I realized that for decades, I'd defined myself primarily through my relationships with my family. I was a mother, a sister, a daughter. I was the strong one, the reliable one, the one who could always be counted on. And I'd organized my entire life around being those things. What I hadn't allowed myself to be was just Mary. Just a person with her own needs and her own worth, separate from how useful I was to other people. The inheritance became more than just money in my account. It became a symbol of my father's belief in me, and through that, I started to believe in myself in a different way. I started to believe that I was worth protecting, that my time was valuable, that my needs mattered, that I deserved to have boundaries and to maintain them, even when people I loved got angry about it. A year after I discovered those documents, I was sitting in my therapist's office, and she asked me something that I'd been avoiding thinking about directly. "Do you feel like you've forgiven your children?" she asked. I thought about that for a long time. "I don't know," I finally said. "I don't think forgiveness is the right word. It's not like I'm harboring active anger toward them anymore. But I also don't think I trust them the way I used to. And I'm not sure I ever will. Does that feel like a loss to you?" she asked. "It does," I admitted. "But it also feels like I'm protecting something important. I think I have to accept that my family isn't what I thought it was. They're people with their own limitations and their own selfishness. And that doesn't mean they don't love me. But it means that loving them can't require me to sacrifice my own well-being." "That sounds like wisdom," my therapist said. "I built a new life with the inheritance, and it was a good life. But the most important thing I did with it wasn't spending it or investing it or traveling on it. The most important thing I did was use it to establish my independence and my self-worth in a way that I'd never done before. I created a separate trust with a portion of the inheritance for my grandchildren's education, something I did thoughtfully and deliberately, making sure that each of my 3 children understood exactly what I was doing and why. I wanted them to know that I could still be generous, but I could also be intentional. I could love them and their children without requiring them to love me back in exactly the way I demanded. I also created a living will and a detailed estate plan, and I had every bit of that reviewed by an attorney. I made sure that my wishes would be clearly documented, so that no one could ever challenge them or pretend confusion about what I wanted. In a way, I was creating the kind of clarity that my father had created for me, but that had been obscured by my family's selfishness. The inheritance money, after taxes and living expenses and travel and the treatment of my house, ended up providing me with a very comfortable retirement and a sense of security that I'd never had before. But it also provided something else. It gave me the ability to say no. It gave me the ability to walk away from relationships that didn't serve me anymore. It gave me the ability to be alone and safe, even if that meant being separated from people I'd loved. I think about my father often now, and I think about the fact that he understood something about me that I didn't understand about myself. He knew that I would sacrifice too much for my family. He knew that I would prioritize other people's comfort over my own well-being. And he wanted to protect me from the consequences of that. He wanted to make sure that in my later years I could take care of myself, regardless of how my children treated me or whether they helped me. He was right. He was right about me, and he was right about what I needed. And even though I've struggled with what that inheritance revealed about my family, I've never struggled with the fact that it was the right gift. It was exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it. A year and a half after I discovered those documents, I sat down with each of my 3 children individually. I'd been thinking carefully about what I wanted to say, how I wanted to move forward, and what kind of relationship I actually wanted with each of them going forward. With Linda, I had lunch. We sat outside on a nice day, and I told her that I was ready to move past the immediate anger about the inheritance, but that I needed her to understand something fundamental. I love you, I said, but I can't be the person I was before. I can't be your safety net. I can't be available to you in the way I have been my whole life. And that's not punishment. It's just reality. It's me taking care of myself, which is something I should have done a long time ago. She cried a little, but she also seemed to understand. I get it, Mom, she said. I'm sorry again. I really am. I know, I said. And I believe you. But belief and forgiveness are 2 different things. I believe you're sorry. I'm still working on the forgiveness part. With Marcus, I acknowledged that his business had been the test case for my new boundary, and it had worked out well for him. He'd learned how to solve problems without relying on me, and his company was actually doing better because of it. You know what's funny, he said. Getting turned down by you was the best thing that could have happened. It forced me to actually run my business like a real business instead of just assuming I'd have a bailout if things got bad. I've been more careful, more strategic, and I've made better decisions. Thanks for that. That was gratifying. Not only was my boundary protecting me, it was actually helping him become more independent and more successful. With Patricia, I was able to be the most vulnerable. She'd reached out and apologized first, and there was something about that vulnerability that allowed me to be vulnerable in return. I told her that I'd been thinking a lot about women in our family, about the way we've been taught to take care of everyone else, and about how we tend to internalize that as our primary value. I think that's something that happened to me, to our mother, and possibly to you, I said. And I think that inheritance is a chance for me to break that pattern. To say that I have value independent of how much I'm willing to sacrifice. That's beautiful, Mom, Patricia said. And I think you're right. I'm working on that in my own life. My therapist has been helping me understand how much of my self-worth is tied to whether I'm being productive or helpful to someone. It's been eye-opening. Well, I said, smiling slightly, maybe good can come from all of this. Maybe all of us can learn something. My children will always be my children, and I will always love them. But the relationship is different now. It's clearer, perhaps colder in some ways, but also healthier. There are no unspoken expectations. There's no resentment building underneath pleasant family dinners. There's just an acknowledgement that we're people with our own lives and our own needs, and we can love each other while still maintaining boundaries. I'm 3 years into retirement now, and I've never been happier. I have a sense of security that I built myself, with help from my father's wisdom and generosity. I have time to pursue things that matter to me. I have the ability to be alone without being lonely, and to be with people without feeling obligated. The inheritance has given me all of that. But more than anything, it's given me the freedom to be myself without apology, without constantly calculating how much I can give before I run out. I think about the documents I found on Daniel's laptop sometimes, And I think about how that moment, that discovery, was terrible and painful and also absolutely necessary. I think about the confrontation with my family, and how hard that was, and also how freeing it was to finally stop pretending that everything was fine. And I think about my father leaving me all that money, wanting to ensure my security and my independence. He died 10 years before I even knew about it, but he was still taking care of me, still protecting me, still believing in my right to a secure and dignified life. I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful for the hard lessons I've learned about family and trust, and the importance of valuing yourself enough to protect your own interests. The inheritance was never really about the money. It was about believing that I deserved to be taken seriously, that my needs mattered, that I was worth protecting. And in that, my father gave me something far more valuable than any amount of money could ever be.